Right, so let's continue on with the final exercise here. Now this one actually doesn't, it's unique in the sense that it doesn't use importing, but we're still going to work with Sketch, and so you can see the Sketch file here is included in the Framer folder as well. It's just fun for us to look at, like, hey, you can also use Sketch with importing, but you can also export your layers directly to the images folder and then work with that within Framer. So it's like a fun way to show you that there's different ways to work with Sketch, and also, like, in many prototypes you'll probably want to use importing alongside exporting. Actually, like, you can import like layer hierarchy and then have some static assets that you want to be able to target separately, but you don't want to, maybe you don't want to be able to, or you don't want them to be included in the view by default, so you kind of move them onto the side there. And so this is like a fun way to illustrate like how you would work with that. So we're not going to do any importing here, but it's fun to take a look at the lock screen prototype first here. So you're probably all familiar with this interaction. We're just going to create like a simple version, but pretty accurate version of how the transition works from going to the home screen on your on iOS to the lock screen. Now there's like a couple of neat effects here that are included. So at the very foundation, it's 2 pages, so we can work with the page component. But there's a couple of things that are happening when you swipe to the screen. So the image, your background, your wallpaper is slightly being blurred, and it's not even being blurred based on like your which page you're on. It's actually being blurred as you scroll. So while you're changing the position, the change in the horizontal change in X value basically is used to manipulate the effects or the filters of your background image. And this is something that's really cool and powerful, and that you can also do in Framer using utilities. So we're going to be looking at a utility called Modulate, and we're also going to look at a new set of events that are included in Framer, and these are called change events. Now these two are super powerful. So if you, once you like grasp the concepts of modulating, and you start to understand how change events works, you'll notice that there's a ton of UI patterns and interactions in iOS and in Android and even Windows Phone that you can like really quickly recreate here, or you can do some really unique stuff with it. So that's kind of like the sections here we're going to cover. So let's have a look at the sketch file first a little bit. So here we just have a regular wallpaper image, like a screenshot from my iPhone. Here I recreated the as a separate slice the numpad. So as you can see, like, it just creates the numbers, that's the passcode. We're not going to make it interactive in the sense that you can tap the numbers, but we're mostly going to focus on the transition between screens. And then here we have the time and the status bar as separate layers. And the reason I'm using slices here instead of exporting the groups themselves is because we want to include the transparent pixels here. So if I were to say, okay, I want to target the status group here, and I want to just go to export, then it won't be imported in the correct size. Now that's something you could do manually as well, but it's much easier for us to simply type S in Sketch, draw a slice of the correct screen size, and then we'll automatically have it imported in the correct size, in the correct format. And so there's each of these slices are contained within the layer group. I think most of you are familiar with Sketch, right? So you may be familiar with why I'm doing this, but just to illustrate it again, I'm placing the slices within the layer groups, and then on here I'm targeting export group contents only. So while not targeting the trim transparent pixels, because I want these transparent pixels, and yet again I also want the group contents only to be exported. So that brings us to so what I've done, the images folder basically. So what I've done here is I've exported all of these, and within the images folder here, so you can see we have the home transparent layer, the lock screen layer, the status image, and the background image. So the Framer icon is one that's included by default in previous projects, but we don't need that anymore. Alright, so these are now all included in the prototype, right? But we haven't imported anything, so you won't see them in their layer hierarchy or the layer inspector here. So another way to go about this is by simply defining the layers yourself. So here I already included the background layer here which has the width and the height set explicitly, and then it simply references my background.png image here, which brings me to having this background included here. So you still need to set the height and the width value though if you're not using importing.
Quick question based on what Harsa said before about adaptive prototypes and different devices. What can we use instead of width and height?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna, during this example, I'm gonna show you 3 different ways to write the same thing. So you can use, instead of width and height, you can also use dynamic variables, or use the screen property that you've seen in the previous example, or the size property. So I'm going to be covering that as we go along. Yeah. Okay, so let's first start inserting the status bar here on top. So we can simply say, I'm going to just call it status, create a new layer here. Now the status bars in iOS are 40 pixels high, so I'm simply going to set the height to 40. And now we want the width to be the entirety of the screen, right? So I could explicitly write it like 750 pixels, but I could also simply, and you may remember this from the previous example, grab the screen.width. You'll see it now spans the entirety of my screen. Now another thing that's pretty cool about this is that the value of the width is dependent on the preview mode you use in Framer Studio. So if I were to go to full screen mode now, the width would be the entirety of my window. And because I'm using the iOS of the iPhone 6 device now, the variable or the numeric value that is returned from screen.width is exactly 750 pixels. But just to illustrate, and this will may break some things, you see here, this is full screen mode, so you see the layer is now still neatly displayed across the entirety of my preview window here. So, and of course, because we've explicitly set it on the background layer, it's still using the correct values here. If you comment that, you'll see that it'll just span the entirety of the screen. And this is how you can set the devices as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the iPhone 6 again. Right. So now we just want to include the image that we've exported. So I can simply reference it in the images folder, and I call it status.png. And you'll see it will neatly pop up right here. Now the reason why it's positioned perfectly in this case is because by default, of course, the X and Y positions are set to 0. And the reason that the padding is correct is because we have exported this using a slice. So you can see here, this is what we've exported here. All right. So now we want to again create a very simple page component. So we simply call it page again. And so another way for us to define width and height is using size. So just like frame is a shortcut or an alias for x, y, width and height, size is an alias for width and height only. So you can see the size property is also a property of the screen. So here I simply say the size of the layer equals the size of the screen. So you can see from top to bottom there are like multiple ways of either explicitly defining width and height or size, or using both numeric values and dynamic values, or simply just putting it all within dynamic values or variables. So this is pretty cool. And again, if I were to go to full screen mode, then it will grab the width and the height of my entire window. So now within our sketch file, we have a couple other layers exported here. So we have the home, which is basically a transparent layer that can sit on top of our wallpaper here. And then we have the lock screen here. So these are respectively titled home and numbers. So what we can do is we can say, create a new home layer here. Create a new, and we can again set the size to be the screen. We set the image. And you'll see it pop up. Now the reason there's still this blue background here is because we've created a page component, but we have not set anything in the page.content layer. So if you recall from the previous exercise, and this is a nice illustration of the effect, this blue layer is the page.content layer that is automatically being created for you. But if there's not anything in the layer, so there's no image for it to grab onto, it will be just displaying the default properties of a layer. So in this case, we have explicitly defined the width and the height, we haven't changed the background, and we haven't set an image. So that's why you're seeing the blue background still. Now, we're first going to create the number layer as well, but you'll see, and I think this will maybe help clarify the different ways of adding pages to the page component, because you'll see what happens when we start adding these layers manually this time instead of within a loop. So let's also create the numbers layer now. Again, screen.size and the image is numbers.png. Now, this is obviously kind of a mess. So we can, what we want to do now is we want to start adding pages or our layers to our page.content layer. Now, what you saw in the previous exercise, that we explicitly created layers, or we targeted layers actually from Sketch, and then we placed them in the content layer ourselves. But there's also methods included in Framer that allow you to do this for you. So what we have is we have a method called page.addPage, and it is a function or a method that allows you to target layers specifically and to add them to your page component, which effectively places it within the content layer for you. So another cool thing to remember is that pages by default are always added to the right. So that's why you saw in the previous example, we didn't specify any direction, right? We just added them to the content layer, and all pages were automatically positioned next to each other. So that is another thing that the page component takes care of, but it's also something that's customizable. So what you can do here is you can specify either adding a page to the right or to the bottom. So if you want to have pages to the left and the right and the top, you can also do that, but you have to also use page snapping, and we're going to look at that in a minute. So let's first add them here. So first I'm going to add the numbers. You can see the blue background is already being gone. And then home. So all I'm doing here is I'm referencing the variable names of my layers. And now I'm adding, this is like a way for me to manually add 2 pages. So as you can see, we first added the numbers layer here to the left, and then the home layer. And automatically it gets positioned to the right. Now, the addPage method actually takes a second argument. So it's fun to look at that real quick. So effectively this is the same, and this is a default property, as writing this. But in most cases you'll add page to the right and you don't need to explicitly define this, except in the case when you want to add it to the bottom. Then you can write bottom. And now you see it gets positioned below my layer. And again, the snapping being horizontally or vertically is automatically being taken care of as well. So in this case, there's no reason for us to specify it explicitly though.
Sorry, how does it know to scroll between those two? How come, what's making it do that right now?
So basically what it does is it looks at the size of both layers and the screen size. And you can see in the page content here, if you inspect it, that either it positions it on the right or the left, and then it adapts the size of the content layer to be the sum of those totals, which in this case, it knows the direction, it knows the size, and it knows the size of each of your layers. So it can calculate when to snap and in which direction to snap for you. Yeah. And it's still like very little code to create this pretty cool interaction already. And again, this is all internally. This is still a draggable layer. So if you were to wanted to really customize this, you can also customize the bouncing, how it feels, right? How fast should the momentum options be between these pages? You can create like a really bouncy switch between pages if you'd like. So, oh sorry. Yeah.
If you have another page, so a third one, right? How would we add it to the right? So we have home, numbers, and I don't know, settings for example.
So if you wanted to use this method, you can simply just create another layer and then run the method again on that layer, and then it will add it to the right of home automatically.
Right, okay.
So you can just keep on adding pages. Or like with it previously, if you want to do it like in one line, you can just create a loop and set them and run the add page, or you can manually insert them in the content layer as well. There's like 3 or 4 different ways of going about this, yeah. Okay, so another thing now that we want to fix is that essentially we really wanted to add the page to the left, right? So we don't want to start on the lock screen now, because that's not how it works. But what we can do is we can snap, by default, we can snap to the second page. So effectively we start on the right page and we can switch back to the left page. Now this is something that by default occurs within an animation, but the method has a second parameter which allows you to set it to false. So it's an animation parameter. And if you set it to false, and I'll show you in a bit, then it will snap by default. So you can see here that there's actually multiple methods included. So you can snap to the next page by default, or snap to the previous page, but in this case we're going to use snap to page. And we're going to say home. And you can see that whenever you refresh now, it will animate towards home, which is pretty cool. And in some cases it's something that you'd love, but in this case it's something that we don't want. So we can just set the second argument, false. And now you see that whenever we refresh, it automatically snaps to the next page. Let me just comment that out as well. So as you can see, we're already like pretty close to having the interaction. There's still a few things missing here, so we haven't set any vertical scrolling. So let's just disable that real quick as well. So now we cannot snap up and down anymore. But there's still quite a few things missing here. So if you remember on iOS, there's a couple of things that occur. So the background gets blurred. Now if you were to only blur this image, which is exactly the dimension of the screen, you would notice the edges a little bit and the background layer was shining through, right? So if I were to blur this image here, you would start to see a little bit of a black edge on every corner. And that's something that is also on iOS. So what they also do is they scale the wallpaper just a tiny little bit, say 1.1. So you don't see the edges of the screen and nothing peeks through. So there's a blurring animation that occurring depending on the distance of your scroll or your swipe. There's also an opacity animation occurring, so the wallpaper gets darkened. And finally there's a little bit of a blur occurring. And what's cool is that the intensity of the blur, the intensity of the scaling, and the intensity of the opacity or the darkening is all depending on how far along you are. So you can just keep holding it and swiping and you'll see the values update accordingly. So this is something that's actually really cool and easy to do in Framer as well. So we want to specifically target the content layer now. So since it's just the layer, we can just target it like this. And these are the events I mentioned in the beginning. That's actually a new type of events in Framer. And these are called change events. So every property or every numeric property in Framer emits change events. So what is happening is effectively we are, if you remember what I tried to illustrate over there, is that we are moving the content layer left and right in this case, right? And so the screen here or the page component itself is serving as a mask. So what is behind the scenes occurring when we go left and right is that the content layer is moving. So it's moving horizontally. So the X value of the content layer is changing. Now, luckily, since it's a numeric value, we can listen to this change. And even the subpixel changes because by default, again, it has momentum enabled. So if we print this out actually, and this is actually another trick here. So this is also a very powerful and cool thing. What it refers to depends on the scope. So within a function, the code within a function is called a scope, and it basically means the environment that you're working within. So if I'm writing code here, I'm basically working in the global scope, and this is basically just a JavaScript thing, right? So it's the scope of the window. In this case, the function call, or in this case the arrow, defines that I'm working within an event. And then I can reference the scope of my event, and whenever I'm referencing this, it will refer back to my page of content layer. So if you remember in previous examples, we targeted, for instance, we had a click event, right, on a draggable layer. Or the very first example we did, we started with drag start. We referenced the layer A, and we said layer A on drag start, do this. Now, if we were to do layer A.drag start and then this .animate, it will refer back to the layer object, because that's the layer that we targeted. So I can just write it down real quick, and you'll see, if I print this, you'll see that it refers now to my page of content layer. So this is a keyword in JavaScript that always refers back to what it's the scope of what it's targeting. All right. So in this case, I could also do this, of course, which is effectively the same thing. But this is a pretty neat shortcut that can prove to be valuable. So continuing on here, what I wanted to print out actually was the x values here. So you can see that as I'm moving along, it recognizes that the x values are changing. And if I toss it around, it will start my momentum, and you'll see that it will bounce a little bit, and that's why it's snapping to subpixels. So because it is calculating, okay, I'm having a bit of friction, I'm having a bit of tension, so I'm actually bouncing a tiny little bit, even with a very little friction, and you'll see the subpixel value that it's calculating for you. So it's actually moving a very little bit like this, very slowly. And it's cool because you can also print these values, you can round them, and you can do anything with these if you like. In this case, this is exactly the values we want to be using. So it ranges from -750 to 0, which makes sense because the width is 750 pixels, and we're going from the right to the left. So now we know how to target these change events and how to retrieve these values whenever they change. Now, the change events can be used in general in Framer for everything, any numeric value. So rotation, Y, width, and height changes, and these allow you to do some really cool things. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to say, okay, whenever the x changes, we want to take these values, map them to a different range, and then apply these new values to a different property. And this is something that can be done with Modulate. So think of Modulate as basically having an input, in this case the x value changing, setting a range. Okay, what does this input mean in relation to a different set of numbers? So let's say we have 750 to 0, and we want to map that to be from 0 to 20, right? That's something that we can do. And we can map that to be from 0 to 1. So it's basically a little bit of a thing for us to, or a tool for us to take a set of numbers and to turn it out into something else, and then to apply it to a different property. So I'm just going to start showing you here. So let's first do the blur, which is actually the most fun one. So I don't need this print anymore. I'm just going to say page, or no. We want to target the background image, right? So we want to target the background layer here. Now maybe it's easier to start with this actually, so this will turn into some personal work. Okay, so I'm defining the blur property here, and this is how Modulate looks. So any utility is prefixed with Utils. So Modulate takes 3 sets of values. It takes an input first, then comma separation, a range, and then another comma, a second range. Now it may look tricky at first, but once you grasp this concept, you'll see that it's actually pretty straightforward and it's really powerful. So in this case, we want the this.x to be the input. Then we have our first range here. Our second range, and we close. So we know what the first range is, right? Because we just printed it out. So we know that the range that the input returns is exactly minus 750 to 0. So this is exactly the range that is returned and the range we want to use because this is the input. So we say from 0 to 50 to 0. And now here is basically whatever we want to map these values to. So the blur by default is set to 0, I think. And so we want to maybe set it to, I don't know, 4. But we can just play around with this continuously. And then the modulate method has a fourth parameter, which is basically if you want to limit the range or not. So if we set the final value here to true, what we're effectively doing is we're saying, okay, whenever you exceed 4, stop and stay at 4. If we don't set this, then it's very possible for it, think about it, right, overdragging, right? It's very, or tossing a layer around, it's possible for it to exceed the 4 when it's mapped to this range. But when we set this to true, by default set to false, by the way. But when we set it to true, we make sure that whenever it hits 4, it stops and it continuously will output 4. So it's a way for us to limit the outputs of the second range here. And now you see that we have a very slight blurring occurring, but we can increase it a little bit. Let's say from 0 to 20. And now you see that whenever I change, it starts blurring my background layer depending on how far I'm dragging. So even as I'm dragging, it's updating. And you can even print out these values here. So let's say print background.blur. And you see exactly the output here, which is like very helpful to see. And it neatly starts from 0 all the way back to 20. And it's fun to notice that pretty quickly we're hitting the 20 here. But at no point when we continue dragging the other direction does it go over 20 because we set the last range to true. So let me just try to remove that real quick. And you see now that if we don't set it to true, it can actually go all the way to 30 if we continue dragging beyond the constraints. Now, a couple of things you notice here. This is the effect I was mentioning. You can see because the image is exactly at the size of the screen, it is blurring the image, so you can kind of see the black wall, the black edges peeking through, and it's not really pretty, so we don't want that. So there's a very easy thing we can do here. We can just create a new modulate here, but instead use it to scale up the wallpaper just a tiny little bit. So we copy the line, we target the scale property instead, and now the input and the ranges are still the same, right? But we want the output to be different. So we don't want the scale to go from 0 to 20, because it's obviously going to be way too much. But we want the scale to go from 1, which is the default, so maybe 1.1, maybe 1.2. So we can simply go here into the second range and say from 1 to 1.2. And let's also print them out. So now you see that as we're dragging very subtly, the layer scales with us, and there's no peaking edges here. There's no blurring or black edges, blurred black edges visible around the edge anymore. And you can see that neatly our limit is working, and it's going from 1.2 back to 1, and everything in between.
What's the fourth attribute that you have in the modulate?
Oh, the fourth attribute is the limit that I mentioned. So you can see that neatly now as we blur, it's actually nicer to use the blur value here. If we print out the blur values, you see that once it hits 20, it stops. And even if you continue dragging, it still outputs, it still recognizes that, hey, the X value is still changing, but it can never exceed 20. So we can just continue dragging here and it will neatly hit 20. And if we turn it to false, and by default set to false, you'll see that when we switch to the page and we continue dragging here, it actually exceeds our second range. So in many cases, when using Modulate, you probably want to set it to true as well. There's very little use cases that I've personally found where I didn't want to limit the range specifically. So finally, to basically finish this prototype, we want to set the change the opacity values as well. So we can just simply target the opacity property from our background layer here. Create a new modulate. Target the X as the input. Again, same range. And now we want the second range to be from, I don't know, around 1 to 1.7, 1.6. Because we kind of want to darken the layer, right? So let's try 0.6. And then set it to true. You'll see that now when we swipe between the layers, the background fades a little bit, it scales a little bit, it blurs, and also the opacity is changed from, I think let's do 1.5. And so this is really, really close to how the iOS interaction works, where you see the background fades and highlights our lock screen here. Now as you can probably see, like, once you start working with Modulate, there's like, you can map any value or any input to any other value in any other property. So this is really offers you so many options. It's like a playground to do so many cool interactions with, like any change, any event, any input that you can imagine can be hooked up to another property, used as input, and then mapped to other values in other properties. So this really allows you to do crazy stuff, really cool stuff. Yeah.
Arson doesn't like it because it makes things easy for him.
Too easy.
I don't like this modulate thing. It makes things very easy. He wants
any questions on like modulate in specific or change events? Is it clear like what modulate does and what it like how it's set up?
Yes. So you can create all of that and you just leave that, and then how do you build the interaction for actually changing the X value can be completely independent?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. You can even, like the X value is also fired whenever you animate a layer, right? So if I say, okay, this layer should animate from here to here with a spring curve or an ease curve, it doesn't matter. And then every change is fired with change events. So if I use states, I target a specific layer for animations. They can all be used and listened to with your change events as long as it's a numeric value. Yeah. Yeah, so I could like create a layer that I'm rotating whenever I load the page, and then I can use that rotation value to do something else. Or I could create a slider where I'm listening to the change values, and whatever it rotates a layer or it changes another numeric value. So it really allows you to do almost anything. And actually the slider component internally, which is another component we actually haven't discussed, that I released a couple of months ago, is also built internally using modulates. So maybe it's actually fun to look at that one next, because these are like the finished 3 exercises, so we have some time left, I think. We have a couple of extras included, so depending on if you have some specific questions or specific things you'd like to see covered in that, we have another example of a Facebook group ad with a view transition that highlights how you can use imported layers and then attach click events, not by targeting them directly, but by drawing framework layers on top of them. And we have another example that is actually the template that you saw in the presentation, that I also have included here in the GitHub page, that allows you to see how easy it is to work with artworks in Sketch, and then to turn them into a set of pages. But it kind of depends on whatever you guys feel like.